There are Hollywood stories that follow a familiar arc. A starry-eyed kid from a small town, a dream nurtured since childhood, years of struggle, and then the big break that changes everything. We've heard that story so many times it's practically a genre of its own. But every now and then, someone comes along whose path into the entertainment world looks nothing like that template. Someone who didn't grow up obsessing over movies, didn't rehearse acceptance speeches in the bathroom mirror, didn't audition for every school play just to feel the rush of applause. Someone who, by all accounts, stumbled into one of the most demanding industries in the world and somehow ended up becoming one of its most respected figures. Jennifer Connelly is that someone. Her story doesn't begin with a burning ambition or a childhood dream. It begins somewhere quieter, more unexpected, and, when you really sit with it, far more interesting. Because the truth about Jennifer Connelly's early life isn't just surprising. It fundamentally reframes the way you see everything she's accomplished since. Once you understand where she started, the choices she made along the way stop looking like a calculated career strategy and start looking like something much more human. A person slowly, sometimes reluctantly, discovering who she is and what she actually wants from the one life she's been given. So let's go back to the beginning, not the Hollywood version of it, but the real one. Brooklyn Heights, New York, in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a neighborhood of brownstones and quiet streets, a borough away from the glittering Manhattan skyline that symbolized ambition and spectacle. It was here that Jennifer Connelly grew up, in a household that was creative and supportive, but not particularly cinematic. Her childhood, by her own description, was shaped more by books and the natural world than by the silver screen. She was a thoughtful, observant child, the kind who notices things, who sits with feelings rather than performing them. Here is the detail that tends to stop people in their tracks when they first hear it. Jennifer Connelly, one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation, did not grow up watching movies. Not in any meaningful, passionate way. There was no defining film that made her fall in love with storytelling. No actress she idolized from afar and dreamed of becoming. Cinema, the art form that would one day define her professional life, was simply not part of her inner world as a child. And it goes further than that. She never performed in a school play. Not once. While other kids were jockeying for parts in the winter pageant or memorizing lines for the spring production, Jennifer was somewhere else entirely. In her own head, in her own world, uninterested in the stage and everything it represented. Acting was not her calling. It was not her hobby. It was not even something she'd seriously considered. This is not a minor footnote. This is the foundation of everything. Because it means that when Jennifer Connelly eventually stepped in front of camera and began building what would become a remarkable career, she was not fulfilling a lifelong dream. She was doing something far stranger and more complicated than that. If Jennifer herself wasn't drawn toward the spotlight, then how did she end up there? The answer, plainly and simply, is her mother. Eileen Connelly was a woman with a sharp eye and a practical mind. She worked in the clothing manufacturing business, a world governed by aesthetics, presentation, and the knowledge that appearance matters, whether we like it or not. When Jennifer was around 10 years old, a family friend made an observation that many people had probably already thought but hadn't voiced. This quiet, striking child had something in front of the camera. A stillness. A presence. The kind of quality that lenses seem to love without being able to fully explain why. Eileen listened. She encouraged her daughter to try modeling, and Jennifer, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of a child's natural desire to please a parent she loved, went along with it. There was no dramatic moment of self-discovery, no sudden realization that this was her destiny. It was simply a door that opened, and Jennifer walked through it because someone she trusted held it open for her. The modeling work came easily enough. Jennifer's features were striking in a way that felt both classical and modern. Dark, expressive eyes, strong bone structure, a face that could hold a frame without doing very much at all. She translated well on camera in that early, effortless way that either makes a career or disappears without a trace. In her case, it led somewhere. Small television commercials followed, then small acting roles, then something that began to look, from the outside like momentum. But momentum and intention are not the same thing. And for Jennifer Connelly, the engine driving her early career had not been built by her own ambition. It had been assembled by circumstance, by a mother's vision, by the quiet machinery of an industry that had spotted something it wanted and reached out to claim it. She was along for the ride, a passenger in a vehicle whose destination she hadn't chosen and wasn't entirely sure she wanted to reach. There's a particular kind of disorientation that comes from being good at something you never set out to do. It doesn't feel like triumph in the way you might imagine. It feels more like standing in a room you wandered into by accident and realizing that everyone around you seems to think you belong there, while you're still not entirely sure you agree. Jennifer Connelly has spoken in interviews, across different points in her career, about a persistent internal question that followed her even as her professional life expanded. The question was simple but pointed. Do I actually want this? Not in a melodramatic way, not as a crisis, but as a genuine, recurring inquiry that a thoughtful person asks herself when she's honest enough to notice that she's been living someone else's vision of her life. This question didn't paralyze her. She kept working. She kept showing up. But the fact that she was asking it at all, while simultaneously landing roles, building a profile, becoming recognizable, says something important about who she was. She was not an actress driven by ego or by the desperate need for validation that the entertainment industry tends to attract and then exploit. She was something rarer, a person with enough self-awareness to know the difference between what she was doing and what she had chosen. For a child, the distinction barely matters. Children follow the adults in their lives. They trust parental judgment, they move in the directions they're pointed, and they discover who they are along the way. But as Jennifer moved through her teenage years, that early question started carrying more weight. The child who had been nudged toward a camera by a well-meaning mother was becoming a young woman who would eventually have to decide, for herself, whether this life was truly hers to live. In 1986, when Jennifer Connelly was 14 years old, she was cast as Sarah in Jim Henson's Labyrinth, a fantasy film that placed her alongside David Bowie's magnetic and otherworldly Goblin King. It was, by any measure, a surreal environment for a teenager who had never even done a school play. The production was enormous in scale and strange in every dimension. Jim Henson's team of puppeteers and practical effects artists had created a world that was dense, imaginative, and genuinely bizarre. A living, breathing maze of creatures and illusions that had to be navigated not just by the characters, but by the young actress at its center. And then there was Bowie himself, a cultural icon of almost incomprehensible stature, exuding the kind of charisma that can fill a room before a person even speaks. For a 14-year-old still finding her footing in an industry she hadn't consciously chosen, the whole experience must have been equal parts thrilling and overwhelming. What the role demanded was significant. Sarah is the emotional anchor of the film, the character through whom the audience experiences everything. She had to carry scenes of fear, wonder, frustration, and quiet courage, often surrounded by puppets and visual effects rather than the kind of grounded human interaction that typically helps young actors find their footing. Every scene required imagination, technical awareness, and an emotional maturity that most 14-year-olds would struggle to manufacture on demand. The film was not a commercial success when it was released. It arrived at the box office and quietly underperformed, which in the brutal economy of Hollywood is a bruise that young careers don't always survive. For Jennifer, who had not sought out the role as the fulfillment of some creative ambition, the disappointment may have landed differently than it would for someone who had poured years of longing into the opportunity. She had given the work everything it asked of her. The industry's verdict was its own business. But here is what makes Labyrinth genuinely remarkable in the context of Jennifer Connelly's story. Time did what box office receipts could not. The film found new life with subsequent generations of viewers, becoming a cult classic of extraordinary warmth and staying power. Decades after its release, people who were not yet born when it came out were discovering Sarah's journey through the labyrinth and feeling something real. And at the center of that experience was a 14-year-old girl who had never even been in a school play, holding the whole fantastical improbable thing together with a presence that turned out to be more than enough. As Jennifer moved into her late teens and early 20s, the role she was offered began to shift in a direction that the entertainment industry of that era found entirely predictable, even if she did not. Hollywood had noticed her beauty in the specific, transactional way that Hollywood notices things, as a resource to be deployed rather than a quality belonging to a full human being. Films like Career Opportunities and The Rocketeer, both released in 1991, brought her to broader audiences. They were mainstream productions with real distribution and real visibility, which mattered professionally. But they also came with a particular kind of framing, one that positioned her more as an image than as a performer. Promotional materials for these films leaned heavily on her appearance in ways that reduced her to a surface rather than a person. She was being sold as something to look at, and the distinction between being seen and being looked at is not a subtle one when you're the person in the frame. What's striking about this period is not that it happened. It happened to virtually every young woman in Hollywood at the time, and many would argue it still does, but what Jennifer did in response to it. She did not lean into the it girl momentum that these films could have generated. She did not chase the roles that would have maximized her visibility as a glamorous figure. Instead, she began quietly pulling back, turning down projects that felt reductive, distancing herself from a version of her career that felt like it belonged to someone else's idea of who she was. This was not a loud rebellion. She didn't make speeches about it or write public letters of complaint. It was a quieter form of resistance, the kind that looks like nothing from the outside but represents, internally, a fundamental refusal to be flattened into an image. She was slowly and deliberately trying to find a version of this career that felt like her own rather than a costume she'd been handed. There is a moment in many people's lives when the gap between the life they're living and the life they actually want becomes too wide to ignore. For Jennifer Connelly, that moment arrived in the mid-1990s, and her response to it was both unconventional and quietly brave. She enrolled at Stanford University, at a time when her profile was established enough to sustain a busy, commercially successful career. She chose instead to pause. She went to study literature and drama, not as preparation for more auditions, but as a genuine attempt to ask and answer larger questions about what she was doing and why. She wanted to understand storytelling from the inside, to read widely and think seriously about the craft she had been practicing without ever consciously choosing it. She left before completing her degree, which matters less than the decision to go at all. What the Stanford years represented was something rare in an industry that runs almost entirely on momentum, a willingness to stop, to sit with uncertainty, to refuse the comfortable acceleration of a career that was already working and ask whether working was enough. This is the kind of decision that people looking for simple success stories tend to gloss over, but it may be the most important chapter in Jennifer Connelly's early life. Because what she was doing at Stanford, what she was really doing beneath the coursework and the academic setting, was building a relationship with her own agency. She was converting a career that had been handed to her into one that she would eventually, consciously, choose. It would be easy to look at Jennifer Connelly's early life as a series